Chapters 3 and 4. The pups made the excursion to the mouth of the den the next day and the day after that. Soon they spent most of their time out of doors, retreating to the den only at night or if their mother gave warning. Each time the pups emerged into the day, Runt was the last in line, but his enthusiasm for the world he found there never waned. When Swift-footed Rabbit hopped out of her burrow, Runt raced after her. That he never came close to catching her didn't discourage him at all. Daily he chased Squirrel up a tree, then barked at him in a high, excited voice. "Come down, Squirrel! I dare you to come down!" Squirrel scolded and swore and twitched his tail in irritation. They both knew that Runt was about as likely to catch him as he was the wind, but that knowledge didn't stop them from playing the game. Runt's zeal was far greater than his small frame and often sent him stumbling over his paws or tripping over an exposed root. Or it let him discover that the mudslide created by otter in the lake bank was slippery, that the lake itself was cold and wet. "Please take care," his mother sighed, licking him dry. "Look before you leap," Helper warned, untangling him from a stand of prickly raspberry bushes. "Stupid pup," Bitter muttered, not helping at all. Even Thinker scolded him sometimes. "Think," he warned again and again. "You've got to stop to think." And Runt did think, of course, though usually only after he found himself in difficulty. Then he thought that if he were only a little bigger, staying out of trouble would be much easier. Being small never kept him out of the fray, though. He and his brothers and sisters leaped at one another, strengthening muscles, improving hunting skills, jockeying for place and position in the pack. Whatever the prize might be, however, it never fell to Runt. "Keep trying," Hunter said. "It's good practice. You're growing stronger every day," Helper told him. "You're growing bigger, too," his mother often said. But Bitter, when he was near, sneered at the other's encouragement. "Bigger than what?" he would say. "A mouse? A sparrow?" For there was no question. Runt remained the smallest, the weakest, the least apt in the litter, a fact he didn't need Bitter to point out. And Runt knew that his father knew it too. King never said anything, either to criticize or to encourage him. He only just watched. He watched when Runt lost a game of tug of war to Runner over a bone, when Leader slapped Runt to the ground and held him there, when Silver stood to nurse the pups and Runt was the only one who couldn't reach, and always King's golden eyes seemed to ask the same question: "Can you do it? Will you survive?" "I can," Runt wanted to cry. "I can, I can." And to prove himself, he'd go spinning around his tail until he tumbled into a dizzy heap. Or he'd snap a bumblebee and get his nose stung. King would just turn away. Sometimes the pups took on one another's names. One morning, Runner jumped on Leader and knocked him to the ground, rolling him onto his back until he squealed. For the rest of that day, Runner became Leader, and the first Leader was without a name. That evening, though, Leader jumped Runner from behind, flipped her over, and held her down, sharp baby teeth to her throat. And their first rolls were returned back. Once, when Snifter was busy investigating a snail, Thinker noticed a stench in the air that none of the pups could name. He reported it to his father. "It's them," King said darkly. "Humans. Humans." And though none of the pups knew what humans might be, they all crouched low in their skins and shivered. Still, Thinker proudly took the name of Sniffer for the rest of the day. The next day, Sniffer sorted out the rich smell of a deer hidden in the trees on the other side of the lake and sent the hunters off in pursuit. The buck was strong and healthy and escaped easily, but Sniffer had her name back nonetheless. Runt, however, remained Runt. None of the other pups ever tried to steal his name. Leader, runner, sniffer, thinker. These were gifts to bring to the pack. But being a runt was no gift. Runt refused to worry, though. He would find his gift one day. He knew he would. And with it would come a new name. That's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. It's time, King called to the hunters. The pack circled around the black wolf. Silver and Bitter and the two yearlings sniffed his face, touched his muzzle, raised their voices in reply. It's time, they echoed. King tipped his head back and began a howl. The other adults and the yearlings joined in. They sang, their voices lifting and falling, twining around one another and separating again, until 5 wolves sounded like 10 and like 20. The pups hadn't yet learned how to howl, but they joined the song as they could. They bunched their faces together, lifted their small muzzles to the sky, and yipped and yipped. It's time, King said again, and he moved out toward the surrounding forest in an easy lope. Helper stayed behind as usual. Since the pups had arrived, his job in the pack was to babysit, but the rest of the hunters fell in behind their leader in a single file line. Silver, Bitter, Hunter. Each one stepped in the footprints of the one before, so the tracks they left were nearly those of one wolf. Their big paws splayed as they touched the earth and curled as they lifted. Their entire bodies whipped forward in an easy bouncing rhythm. They could keep such a pace, about 5 miles per hour, for half a day without pausing. Once the hunters had moved out, Helper picked up a stick in his mouth, held it up in a teasing way, then ran to the middle of the clearing. All the pups except Runt tumbled after him. Runt remained where he was, gazing after the departing hunters. To be able to hunt was a gift. It was perhaps the most important gift of all. If he was going to learn to be a good hunter, he needed to begin. And without a glance toward Helper and his littermates, Runt set off after the hunters. The small black pup followed along the edge of the lake. He followed into the hushed pines, and even when he could no longer see the tip of Hunter's tail ahead, just disappearing among the trees, he continued to follow, nose down, pursuing his family's warm and familiar scent. The first time he stopped, or even hesitated, was when a grosbeak called down to him from a tall pine. You must be King's son, he said. You look just like him. You're small, though. Very small. I'm part of the hunt, Runt replied, deciding to ignore the rude remark about his size. He studied the bird's smoky red head. I beg to differ, he replied. You aren't part of the hunt at all. The hunters are far ahead. Where have they? Runt started to ask, but the bird had already spread its wings and risen into flight. Runt gave his shoulder a lick to wash away the insult of the bird's sudden departure. He didn't need anyone to tell him how to locate his family anyway. He put his nose to the pine duff again and set off once more on their trail. The scent was growing fainter, though, and as the force that pulled him along grew less strong, Runt began making various stops and detours. First, he paused to listen to a chorus of peepers. Then he zigged after a swallowtail butterfly. A stream, dashing along at its own busy pace, called him for a long drink. Runt sat down on his haunches, his muzzle dripping. Had the hunters crossed here? Snuffling along the bank, both up and down, he found no trace of their scent. Maybe it would take up again on the other side. But when Runt splashed across to the other bank, he couldn't find his pack smell there either. He kept moving nonetheless. He had come too far to consider turning back. Runt trotted, then plodded, then trotted again. Though he followed nothing now, no disappearing tail, no diminishing scent. He kept going and going until finally he had no choice but to stop and admit to himself and to the watching forest that he was, well, and truly lost. An enormous woodpecker hammering mirrored at a nearby tree, the noise of his assault echoing through the woods. Runt sat listening, but even when the hammering stopped, he didn't attempt to ask for directions. Woodpeckers tended to be crabby fellows. Maybe it was all that pounding. A striped chipmunk scurried past. Runt laid a swift paw on his back, holding him fast. Do you know where the hunters went? He asked. I know where my family is, Chipmunk chittered nervously. Nothing more. Runt studied the bulging cheeks, the stripes, the tiny fluff of a tail. You're much smaller than I am, he announced finally. So what? Chipmunk squealed, rather boldly. Runt thought, for one being held down by the weight of a paw. Now, let me go. I have to carry these seeds to my family. Obediently, Runt lifted his paw and let the little fellow scurry away. What difference did it make that Chipmunk was small? He carried seeds to his family. Weasel emerged from beneath a tree stump. Have you seen the hunters? Runt called. But the sleek brown fellow disappeared into a thicket of June berries without bothering to answer. Run was beginning to realize that following the hunters might have been a rather serious mistake. If he had stayed home, he would be napping in a comforting pile with his litter mates now, or pouncing on patient helper's tail, or simply waiting for the hunters to return with meat. He sat down in the middle of a patch of jack in the pulpits and looked around. The forest was familiar, but entirely strange at the same time. He was clearly far from home, and he no longer had any idea which way to turn to get back. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He tipped his head back, drew his lips into a tight O, and began to yip and cry like any other lost pup. But after the first few yips, something happened unexpectedly. A howl rose on the sweet summer air. The sound startled Runt. Had it come from his own mouth? He stopped, then lifted his head and tried to yip again. Another long howl, as lost and lonely sounding as he felt, floated toward the arching sky beyond the green branches. He liked the sound, so this time he didn't stop. He just howled and howled. What do you want? The voice was deep, filled with authority. Runt looked down. A pair of large paws stood before him, slender legs, silver fur. Mother, he cried. But the stern gray face towered over him was not his mother's. It was not, in fact, the face of any wolf he had ever seen before. Why are you in my territory? The great wolf demanded. Runt wanted to answer, but no further sound would come from his mouth. It was as though the remains of his voice had sailed away on the word mother. He could do nothing. In fact, before this stranger, but tuck his tail, lower his body to the ground, and tremble. Why are you here? The wolf repeated. I am king of this place, and you are not part of my pack. Please, Runt stammered. I'm looking for my family. He didn't dare look again into the face of the great wolf standing over him. Are they here? The great king demanded to know, the fur along his spine rising to attention. No, Runt admitted. I'm the only one, and I seem to be lost just a bit. Just a bit, the wolf repeated, and Runt detected something in his voice that was almost a smile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the gray king said, Follow me. Just that. And he turned and walked away. Runt followed meekly. He had no idea where he was being taken, but he kept close behind the gray king, clambering over fallen trees, circling boulders, slogging through marshy patches that the other wolf stepped over, or around, or through. without even seeming to notice. When they reached the stream Runt had crossed earlier, the king stopped and sniffed a rock, standing at the edge of the water. Then he lifted his leg and left a message. "This is my territory," the message said. "If you are a wolf, stay away." "I thank you," Runt murmured, stepping into the stream. I'm sure my father thanks you too." The wolf didn't answer, only stood watching Runt cross back to his family's territory. There was, though, something in his intense gaze that reminded Runt very much of another king entirely, one who wore a black coat and carried a white star on his chest. "I will forgive your trespass," the golden eye said, "but only because you are young and foolish and small, much too small." Runt ducked his head and headed away from the stream. And the watching Gray King, though he still had no idea how he was going to find his family or how he was going to find his way back to the den, for that matter. It's the end of chapter 4.